Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good whatever time of day it is. Thank you for tuning in to Conversations with Dr. Don. For you first-time viewers, Conversations with Dr. Don is an ongoing series of one-hour standalone talk shows where I interview interesting people, like most of you out there, about who they are as unique, one-of-a-kind individuals, and about whatever it is that they may want to talk about. My guest this evening is Jules Boykoff. Did I pronounce that correctly?
You did.
Jules Boykoff, professor. Dr. Boykoff has written this book that you saw on the screen when we first opened, Beyond Bullets, The Suppression of Dissent in the United States. And I must confess I haven't read the entire thing because it's so packed with powerful stuff, and I'm just excited to have him on the show to talk about his book and who he is. And I'm more than curious about the book. I'm curious about how it is this human being got so curious that he's done this huge amount of work to come up with this sort of a book and this kind of information that the voting citizenry needs to know about for sure. How should I talk to you, Dr. Boykoff, Jules, or what?
How about Jules?
Jules. I'm still kind of nervous, yeah. I met Jules through my friend David Doak, who's been on the show a number of times in the past, who is the vice chair of the local chapter of the Alliance for Democracy here in Portland. And David was talking about the media, and we were chewing the fat about things going on in our country and our society now, in the election, and why it is that we're in the state that we're in now, and we have the present administration that's running our country and attempting to run the world. And somehow he mentioned Jules, and he said, you got to have him on the show. Well, you know what David did? He upped and got sick, and he called me yesterday. He says, I can't be on the show because I've got this bronchitis, and he doesn't sound good at all, so get well soon, David. But anyhow, he submitted 6 questions that we might address as we talk about what's going on here. But as you know, your regular viewers, the show is usually broken down into 2 or 3 major segments. And the first segment is what I call simply the bio segment. And I'll read a little bit of what Wikipedia says about Jules. But I didn't start the way I usually start. Usually I start with saying how I feel, and then you can say how you feel, because I'm a retired psychologist, touchy-feely kind from the 60s. Well, the real reason I do that, as you know, is because if I'm anxious or nervous and I say, oh, I'm nervous right now, by the very act of saying that, I'm no longer nervous and my shoulders drop and I can talk better. And I'm not nervous anymore. How are you, Jules?
I'm doing great. I want to thank you for having me on the show. I'm really happy to be here to talk with you.
I'm flattered. I really am.
Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah. So, shall I read a little of what Wikipedia says about you?
Sure.
All right. Jules Boykoff, born September 11, 1970, is a professor and author. His research areas include social movements, the suppression of dissent, and the role of the mass media in U.S. politics, especially regarding coverage of climate change issues. He is currently an assistant professor of politics and government at Pacific University in Forest Grove, Oregon, where in 2007, students selected him as recipient of the Trombley Award for Teaching Excellence. Teaching Excellence, yeah. He also held a visiting professor position at Whitman College in Walla Walla, Washington during the 2004-2005 school year. Boykoff has appeared on various radio shows, including Alternative Radio, Living on Earth, Counterspin, the Tom Hartman program, Tom Hartman, one of my heroes, and Media Matters with Bob McChesney, to discuss the intersection of politics, the media, and global warming. The intersection of politics, the media, and global warming. Oh. He is the author of 2 books on the suppression of dissent. Beyond Bullets, that you saw in the opening of the show, The Suppression of Dissent in the United States, and The Suppression of Dissent, How the State and Mass Media Squelch U.S. American Social Movements. Boykoff is also a published poet. He is the author of Once Upon a Neoliberal Rocket Badge, Once Upon a Neoliberal Rocket Badge. I got to get that. That's an intriguing title. And his poem, Commandment Number 8, was named 2006 Sexiest Poem of the Year by Philadelphia poet C.A. Conrad. With his longtime partner, Kaya Sand, who is also a poet, Boykoff runs the Tangent Reading Series in Portland, Oregon. And that's enough for now about you. Can you say a little more about yourself, and then I'll ask you a few more questions to round that out. But I want to be sure and leave enough time for the questions that David sent to me, and for you can talk about the book. And I don't want to talk too much. I want to hear from you.
Okay.
If I were to ask your best friend, who is Jules Boykoff, what would they say?
Well, she'd probably say he's my husband. You mentioned Kaya Sand there, and she and I do collaborate on a number of cultural, political, activist type activities, including the reading series that you mentioned. And we also have written quite a bit together for many years. About a decade, we published a zine, an informal magazine called The Tangent. I should say we also collaborate on that reading series with another poet named Rodney Kernica, so I believe deeply. She'd probably tell you he believes deeply in collaboration, in the spirit of working together toward goals that you share. So I'm pretty sure she'd say something to that effect.
That's neat how you slip right into your wife when I asked your best friend, asked you about your best friend. Mm-hmm. That's cool. So what's your full name, your whole name?
Jules Maxwell Boykoff.
Maxwell. How'd you get that name, Maxwell?
Well, it was my grandfather's name. And so, a great-grandfather, that is. And so, my brother's name is Maxwell as well. It's a family name.
Mm-hmm. And I think you mentioned you're from Portland. You're in Portland now, mm-hmm. Portland, Oregon. And were you born here?
I was born in Wisconsin, Madison, Wisconsin. Lived my first 20 years in Madison. So.
Camera 2 is going to be cheering over there because she's from Wisconsin. Hi, Camera 2. Anything significant about your cultural or national heritage that's worth mentioning, or shall we pass that?
Well, I guess you might say my dad's side of the family is Jewish, and my grandfather, whose name is Jules as well, who I was named after, he experienced a lot of discrimination. He went through law school and became a lawyer, and then found it hard to get work. And so part of my family has experienced discrimination based on religion, and I think that's had an effect on my thinking and sort of my general stance and approach to life, to sort of try to have a sensitivity toward people that experience discrimination based on certain things that they have absolutely no control over and things they should probably be pretty proud about. So I think that experience and that family background is relevant to the kind of work that I'm doing now in terms of writing down, documenting how the government and media suppress dissent. Often these groups are marginalized groups for various reasons based on race, religion, other social categories. And so I think there is a linkage there in terms of my own family background. I mean, the other thing is my grandfather on my mom's side, the other side of the family, was extremely hardworking, as was my grandmother. And they taught me just you show up at work and you work hard. You're going to show up some days and you're not going to feel that good, and that doesn't matter. You got to still keep working hard. And so I learned from them about the value of working hard. You pointed right at the beginning about all the work that went into writing this thing, and it did take a long time to write that. I'd say about 6 years of intense research and writing and revision, and I think a lot of that might have come out of having my grandparents and teaching me about hard work.
Well, I'm still embarrassed. I've read the first chapter and skipped around a little bit. There's certain chapters like Agent Provocateurs and like that, but I can't imagine the amount of work that went into it. And as I said earlier before we went on camera, the idea of the brain power behind that just makes me kind of nervous, but you've put me at ease since then.
Okay, good.
Beyond that, it's an excellent read, I promise. And I've talked to a couple of people who read it too, because I've been passing it around at some of my groups I go to, and they think it's wonderful too. Beyond Bullets, go to the library, pick it up. I think you'll appreciate what you're talking about. And as we talk some more about what's in it, then you'll see why I recommend it so highly. And then your religious preference, where are you now by way of religion? You have a religious preference or any religion at all?
Not really. I mean, I practice culturally some Judaism. You know, we can roll the dreidel. We're pretty open-minded in our family. We also have a daughter who's Native American, so we try to learn a lot of the native practices from Warm Springs. So we're really open and agnostic and try to embrace the beauty of a wide range of religions, actually. Catholicism included, my wife's side of the family.
Mm-hmm. Native American, your daughter.
Mm-hmm.
How'd that come about? Is that okay?
Well, I mean, I guess it's okay. Yeah, I mean, she's wonderful. She's lovely. Her name is Jessica. She's amazing. 5 years old, beautiful girl.
Do you like her?
Oh, you picked up on that. Yes. I was thinking about her.
You want to tell her something? The camera too there. Can you tell Jessica something?
Hi, Jessica. Thanks for the dance this morning. We were dancing at 7 a.m. as we got ready to get her to school. Thanks for that lovely dance. We were trying to get her ready and up and at 'em and getting ready to wake up. They start at an incredibly early hour in the Portland Public Schools. I mean, 8 a.m. to have a little whippersnapper already at it.
5
Seems a
years
little
old.
early for me, but we danced our way into consciousness this morning, I think. So, hi, Jessica. She means a lot to me.
Yeah. Political persuasion. I got a cameraman over there that thinks he's conservative, and I'm just wondering, do you think that you're conservative or left or right or on the political continuum or what?
Well, I mean, I think we should just have a good talk about politics and let your intelligent audience deduce it themselves as they listen to our conversation here tonight.
Excellent, excellent.
But
So
I will say, you know, your cameraman was mentioning Ronald Wilson Reagan before the show, and you should check out the Book of Poems.
watch your
because
mouth, don't say that.
there are 6 pictures of Ronald Reagan on the cover of my poetry book. So if that makes it any more enticing for you, Doc Don, to check out the poetry, 6 Ronald Reagans beaming off of the cover.
And what's the name of the book again?
Once Upon a Neoliberal Rocket Badge.
Once Upon a Neoliberal Rocket Badge. Somebody remember that. And yeah, I want to check that out. Yeah,
All right.
I belong to a poetry group too. That's another thing I'm into. Sometimes they have those poets on too, but I don't want to go there now. Do you have time for any hobbies or fun? My gosh, can you have any time after doing that book?
I love getting out on the bike. I love running and like watching soccer. Used to play soccer quite a bit, and so it feels good to go watch games and even just watch kids playing at the park. And I love watching soccer and trying to follow it as best I can. Cheering for my old school that I used to play for, the University of Portland. Give a little shout out to them, and I go cheer them on. I've got season tickets, and I get up to the men's games and a number of the women's games each fall as well. Plus, I cheer for my own college where I work now, Pacific University, and a lot of my students are superstar athletes in various sports, whether it's basketball, soccer. So I guess you could say I'm a big sports fan as well. I try to get out there and watch some sports and play a little too.
So I have an idea. I'm going to stop with these kinds of questions for a bit and get into your book. But I have an idea just from chatting with you before the camera started rolling and since about how it is that you are the way you are when you're looking at social justice and discrimination and those kinds of things. Are you your brother's or sister's keeper? That's my last trick question.
Oh gosh, you know, I care very much about I have literal brothers and sisters. I mean, I'll talk about them for a second instead of the more sort of abstract general question. I mean, I do have a brother and a sister. My brother's name is Max, as I mentioned. My sister's name is Molly. And they're both teachers as well. My sister's a teacher at Aloha High School, a really special, talented teacher. My brother's teaching over at the University of Oxford in England right now. So I'm not sure if I'm their keeper in the literal sense. They keep me on my guard, that's for sure, both of them, and keep a good eye on me to help me out. So I thank them both too.
Where are your parents now?
My mom's in Portland, not far from where we are actually, and my dad's in Madison, Wisconsin.
Mm-hmm. Do they like you?
I hope so. Ask them.
All right, so shall we move on?
Sure.
Shall we talk about a little about your book and what's going on before we talk about the questions that David gave me to ask you?
Sure.
Shall we do that?
Sure. Why don't I give an overview, basically, of the structure of the book? I mean, it starts off with a general introductory chapter that you've gotten to read that kind of introduces main concepts like what are the mass media, what are their role in society, what does the government tend to do in most circumstances, these kind of questions. History of the Constitution, the First Amendment, the Fourth Amendment, the Fifth Amendment, these kind of things and how they're important to the practice of dissent. move beyond that, and then each chapter after that is based on what we call a method of suppression or a mode of suppression. So that goes from bullets, the book's called Beyond Bullets, but I do spend a chapter talking about how bullets, beanbag bullets, batons and grenades and even bombs in some cases actually were
violence.
used. Physical violence, direct violence carried out by the government. There's a chapter on that, and each chapter also has case studies from the Black Panther Party to the American Indian Movement to our contemporary global justice movement to anarchists in the early part of the 20th century to mid-century communists under McCarthyism and a whole bunch of groups in between. So it goes a chapter on the bullets, and then, like the book title indicates, you go beyond bullets and look at the subtler ways that the government as well as the media tend to suppress dissent. And I look at 11 other ways that it happens. 7 of them are based on actions of the government or the state, and then 4 of the methods of suppression are based on the actions of the mass media. And again, with each one of those chapters, I give specific examples from U.S. history to try to illuminate how these things happen in the real world. And then I follow that up with a long chapter about how the government and media have tended to suppress dissent after the terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001. So I take this model, these 12 methods of suppression, and I throw them into this new context, post 9/11 U.S. America. And I see, well, which ones are being used more, which ones are being used less, are there new developments within these methods of suppression? And that's pretty much how the book is laid out. And even though that might sound rather bleak, and believe me, I had moments of feeling quite bleak as I did the research and writing for this book. Even though it sounds bleak, actually, I ended up finishing off the book with a great deal of hope. Maybe we can talk about that a little bit later as well.
Let's hope so. Magic word nowadays, hope, huh?
That's true, with the presidential election in full swing. So,
dissent. And some of those organizations you cited dissented against the regime or the government, and some were pretty firm or even close to violence. But I think the problem is this dissent, legitimate dissent, or dissent that's not as radical as the ones you cited, so that the government's involved in suppressing dissent across the board, not just for those kinds of organizations.
That's right. I mean, a lot of the book is about how groups that aren't necessarily super radical in their politics, about how these groups or individuals get marginalized by the media or get surveilled even in some cases by the government. So you're right. I mean, there's a continuum of dissent, what you might call radical on one end, reactionary in terms of right-wing dissent on the other, and then sort of more moderate in the middle. And when I talk about dissent in the book and I define it, I point to groups that work both within the institutional pathways of power as well as those that adopt tactics and strategies that take them outside of the pathways of power, outside of the conventional ways of carrying out politics. So outside of lobbying your Congress member with a telephone call, which I definitely think one should do. You should register your voice by calling your Congress member and senators. But I also write about people that are what some scholars in the field call multiform movements. They take multiple forms. Some of them are letter writing campaigns in a more traditional vein. Others of them engage in what some people call transgressive or outside the boundaries forms of dissent, like a die-in, where you lie on the ground and pretend you're dead to illuminate the number of people that have died in the Iraq War. That would be an example of a transgressive tactic to try to illuminate something you as a dissident are feeling upset about and concerned with.
Why is dissent important?
Well, I think dissent is a crucial cog in the machine of democracy. In fact, I say if you don't have dissent, you don't actually have a democracy. You don't have a healthy democracy. So that's important reason enough, I think. If you don't have dissent, you don't have democracy.
All right, I think I've been given the high sign that I think it's about time for us to take a break. Is that true out there? Okay. Before we go to break, I want to show you 4 important phone numbers to use if you want to call our nation's capital. Can we put up the important phone numbers, please? Because what we'll be talking about, you may decide that you want to call Washington and talk to somebody about dissent and the things that you'll be learning as Jules keeps talking. Anyhow, You can call Washington and tell them what you want and don't want of them. Most of them really do want to hear from you. They do want to hear from you. For you viewers who live in the Washington County part of the Portland, Oregon metro area, Conversations with Dr. Don shows are broadcast 5 times each week. Typically, a new show is first aired on a Tuesday on Channel 11 and is rebroadcast on the following Friday through Monday on other channels. And you can tell your computer-using friends to watch Dr. Don shows on the internet anytime by going to video.google.com and entering Conversations with Dr. Don. And Dennis, my wonderful director there, has put a number of my shows on the internet, not all of them because there's many, 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 but you get an idea of what some of the other guests are like and what some of the other shows are like. So we also have a live call-in show whenever there's a fifth Thursday at 11 in the evening on Channel 11 for your local viewers and viewers in the Tri-County area. You can call in and talk to me and my guest or guests about what we're talking about. And as Jim Hightower says, you can raise a ruckus and voice your joy or unhappiness of what's going on in our country nowadays or whatever else. So can we put up the broadcast schedule now, please? Oh, thanks for hanging in there. I hope you got your cup of coffee or juice or whatever it is you did in that break we gave you. So thanks for hanging in. Now let's get into a little more about what the book is about and what you've been spending the last 6 years doing. Now, my friend David Delk, I mentioned he submitted these questions here, and I showed him the Jews, and we thought, hey, David's mind is still working pretty good, so we'll talk about what's going on by way of these questions that David asked. The first one is, you spend a large part of the book on the role of media in the suppression of dissent ideas. Why is that? Does not media play a neutral role in spreading information?
Well, thanks, David Delk, for sending in the questions, first of all. And sometimes the media, you might be able to argue, does play a neutral role in terms of spreading information out through society, but oftentimes it doesn't. And so I spend a large part of the book, like he said, talking about ways in which the media are anything but neutral, anything but objective. despite the fact that that's the sort of mythical tune that journalists tend to whistle around the water cooler, that they're objective. In many cases, especially when it comes to covering dissent, which is a very complicated issue to cover, I have some sympathy for the media, but especially in that case, they're anything but objective in a lot of instances that I point out in excruciating detail in the book. So I focus on the media because they are ever so important. I mean, a great deal of what we learn about the world comes through the media. After all, we can only get out there into the real world so much. And so we're very reliant on the media for various forms of information. Mm-hmm. After all, we're never going to be able to go down to Mexico and meet Vicente Fox, or we're never going to go to Venezuela and meet Hugo Chavez.
Yeah. Oh.
So we're reliant on the media for giving us information about those people, just to mention two people within the hemisphere. But back to the United States, that's why I think it's important to really focus on the role of the media in terms of what we learn about dissent, especially for people that really don't know any dissidents. And I'm talking about dissidents on the right, conservative dissidents, or liberal dissidents. It doesn't matter to me, but you might not know any of them. You might not have a single friend, relative, acquaintance who has gone out into the streets and fought for something she or he believes in. So then you're really then in that case quite vulnerable to what the media tells you a dissident is. So that takes us to a couple of the methods of suppression from the book that I write about. And one of those is what I call mass media deprecation. The media deprecate or denigrate or poke fun at or portray as bizarre various dissident citizens based on their outward appearance. Perhaps they've got long hair or a shaggy goatee or something, and so they're made fun of for their beard, perhaps, or something like that. So they're sometimes made fun of for their outward appearances. Otherwise, they can be made fun of for their ideology, their belief system. You're a socialist, you're an anarchist, and the media will poke fun at you for that and basically marginalize you through that. So there's mass media deprecation. I did a long study of how the global justice movement, which fights against unfair trade policies, which fights against groups like the World Trade Organization, which questions the principles and policies of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. The global justice movement, I do a long study on them and how the mainstream mass media covered them during two major protests, one in Seattle in 1999 against the World Trade Organization, and then one shortly thereafter in April 2000 in Washington, D.C. against the World Bank and IMF. And what I found when I looked at these media studies, I looked at both television and newspapers, the mainstream media, so New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, LA Times, these sort of newspapers, and then ABC, NBC, CBS, Fox in terms of the television. And what I found was certain trends emerged. One of those trends in the coverage was that the dissidents in Seattle and Washington, D.C. were treated as violent. And that brings up questions, because you actually mentioned violence earlier on in the context of maybe some of these dissidents are violent. I think it all depends on how you define violence. A question I would throw to you and your audience is throwing a brick through a corporate window at Starbucks in Seattle or another corporate window up there at the Gap or something, is that considered violence?
And who is throwing the brick?
Well,
is
that's
it an agent
right.
provocateur?
Well, that's right. And Doc Don, you point to another one of the methods of suppression, which is agent provocateur. Just to make it clear for your viewers what that is, it's when an agent provocateur is somebody that joins a group from the outside who's not actually a legitimate member of the group, or was in the group as a legitimate member but becomes a collaborator with the state, an infiltrator, if you will. And that agent provocateur not only gives information to the government about what this dissident group is doing, but in being an agent provocateur might amp up the violent rhetoric, or might throw that first pipe bomb or Molotov cocktail, or just say, as was the case in Seattle, Washington in the 1970s, a guy named Horace Parker, who infiltrated radical movements within the New Left. He taught them where to get and how to get and ingredients necessary to make a Molotov cocktail. So amping up the level of violence, that's what an agent provocateur does. And yeah, we don't know really in a lot of ways if it was maybe an agent provocateur who threw the bricks through that corporate window in Seattle.
Why would the government be interested in suppressing dissent? Why?
That's a good question. And I mean, for starters, the government is conservative. By that, I do not necessarily mean that they are Republican conservative, but what I mean is that they try to conserve the status quo, which is another kind of perhaps nice way of saying lock in present socio-political relations. So that kind of
Aren't
explains
those
it.
relations fine now? The present social and political situations, why not lock them in?
Well, that's exactly what many people who work for the government would say, that everything is working just fine. We've got stability. After all, we don't have people blowing up the streets. We don't have people armed to the teeth shooting each other in the streets in Portland, Oregon, for instance. So there is grounds for saying, hey, things are relatively okay. It doesn't take a lot of looking around the world to say
For
much
certain
more.
people, things are relatively okay, but I think there's a class struggle going on in this country as well as worldwide.
Mm-hmm.
And the ruling elite, the super rich, if I may, are interested in suppressing any dissent or anything that's going to threaten their power and their privilege.
Well, and I think you're absolutely correct. That is a main reason why governments and their collaborators within the private sector, corporations and whatnot, tend to suppress dissent, because their interests are being threatened. And when they are, they will necessarily speak up and start to take action, as was the case in numerous instances. I mean, our friend David Delk wrote about the instance of Fred Hampton, who was a Black Panther, part of the Black Panther Party in Chicago, Illinois, who was sleeping in his bed on the 4th of December 1969 when a special unit of the Chicago police banged down the door with guns ablazing. Approximately 91 shots fired that night, more than half of them aimed at the head of the bed where Fred Hampton slept. Well, how did they know where to shoot those bullets? Well, it was because there was an agent provocateur named William O'Neill, who had infiltrated the Black Panther Party, who had presented a blueprint of the house where Fred Hampton and other Black Panthers slept, even indicating where the beds were, where the closets were, all this. So that's how the special police unit knew where to shoot the bullets. Also, the infiltrator agent provocateur, William O'Neill, slipped a barbiturate into the drink that Fred Hampton was having that night, Kool-Aid, actually.
Mm-hmm.
And so Fred Hampton dozed off to sleep because of the drugs that were put in his Kool-Aid. Fred Hampton did not use drugs. He was not a light sleeper, yet when he was talking to his mother on the telephone that night, he dozed off to sleep. When the guns came a-blazing, he barely even shuffled his head. And so he was just sitting there as a target, heavily drugged, where he was promptly shot by the police who were coming in. So that's just one instance of a group that was threatening the government. I mean, the Black Panther Party was standing up in Chicago, Illinois, and all around the country, including Portland, Oregon, where Kent Ford, a courageous dissident who's still active today, Kent Ford founded the Black Panther Party in Portland, Oregon. So it wasn't just necessarily a Chicago phenomenon, but that's what happened when Fred Hampton stood up and challenged the way the government was going about things. And you mentioned social class. I mean, Fred Hampton was definitely talking about racial injustice, but he was also talking about class injustice or economic injustice. You can see what happened to Martin Luther King Jr. when he started making his, what some people call, a radical turn toward discussing not simply racial justice, although racial justice is very important, and of course he talked about that for his whole life. But when he made that radical turn later in his life, that was starting to link up racial justice with questions of economic justice. That's when he became a real danger to the state. And if you look at FBI documents from that time period, 1965 and beyond, they're talking about how he could be a real danger to the state. We need to keep an eye on this person, and that's precisely what the government did in the case of one of our dissident heroes in U.S. history. I don't know really anyone who would deny that Martin Luther King Jr. is an emblem of courage, and so yet the government kept a very close eye on Dr. King while he was a dissident.
At the risk of deviating too far, did James Earl Ray kill Dr. King? Any ideas about that?
Well, let me say this. It's a really interesting question, and for those of your viewers that are interested in that question, there is an excellent, thought-provoking book that I highly recommend that doesn't get nearly as much play in the United States as it does in other countries, for example, England. And that book is called An Act of State, The Execution of Martin Luther King Jr., and it's by a guy called William Pepper. And what he basically argues in that book, and I don't touch that in Beyond Bullets, by the way, but what he argues in that book is that it definitely was not just James Earl Ray, and that in fact James Earl Ray was a patsy, and he outlines that in great detail, points out the numerous fishy aspects to that assassination. And so if you're interested in that question, check out that book. Also, I would just mention that the King family, many members of the King family, are in total support of William Pepper and Pepper's work. And in fact, it was, I believe, 1999, November 1999, when they brought a civil suit for a mere $100 against Lloyd Jowers, who ran an institution across the river from where Dr. King got shot, across this little gully from where he got shot. Lloyd Jowers was the proprietor of this, what was essentially a bar. And Jowers brought a suit against him, a civil suit, saying that he was involved and the government were involved in the assassination of Dr. King. And that civil suit ended up going through. The King family won their $100, and that got barely a blip on the mainstream media's radar. Although I had a friend, and my wife as well, who was in England at that time, and she was saying, she said that it was big news actually over in England, this civil suit that ruled that it was 30% Jowers' fault, 70% the government's fault of the execution, the murder, the assassination of Dr. King. So I think it's definitely the reports that the government have printed in the subsequent of Dr. King's assassination do not tell the whole story. So if you want to get a little bit more of that whole story, and I hope you'll do that with a critical sense as well, check out that book. There's a lot to learn, I think.
So there's a perfect example of suppression of dissent, and the instance with Dr. King and Hampton. Now, do you think there's as much suppression going on nowadays with the present administration as there was back in the 60s and that time?
That's a really good question. I mean, the problem with that, figuring out the answer to that question, is that suppression often resides in the cracks and crevices of history. And a lot of times we don't learn about the suppression of dissent until years later.
Yes.
And so it's hard to know what's going on actually right now. Let me take a step backward to answer that question.
Sure.
There was a program, infamous program called COINTELPRO that the FBI ran from 1956 to 1971.
Mm-hmm.
COINTELPRO stood for Counterintelligence Programs. Dr. King, who I was just speaking of, fell within the rubric of that program. He fell in the black nationalist hate group rubric. So the FBI called Dr. King a black nationalist, part of a black nationalist hate group, actually, which is interesting in itself. But that ended in 1971, when on the 8th of March, 1971, a group of dissident citizens calling themselves the Citizens Commission to Investigate the FBI broke into an FBI office in Media, Pennsylvania, and made off with reams of documents that the FBI, where they laid out this program of COINTELPRO. These dissidents then released them to various politicians in Washington, released them to the media, and the media, like the Washington Post and other places, published this information about what the government was doing to those that were practicing dissent. Now, if they didn't do that action, which I'm sure a lot of people that are listening would say that is absolutely insane, that is a mark of stupidity, breaking into an FBI office in Media, Pennsylvania, that's just a mark of craziness. But were it not for that act of craziness or courage or whatever you happen to think it was, we would have never learned, or at least not till much later probably, about that program of COINTELPRO. So we have people that are blowing the whistle nowadays. Take, for instance, the National Security Agency, and they were without warrant, so which is to say illegally, wiretapping calls that were coming into the United States from abroad. Now, the government has many ways they can monitor conversations legally by getting a warrant, say through the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act of 1978. You can get what's called a FISA, Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, warrant. But they weren't doing that, the Bush administration. And we didn't find out about it but for a year after the New York Times had written the story. They sat on the story, only releasing it in December 2005, after sitting on it at the request of the government, who said, hey, if this gets out, this is going to be national security trouble. We absolutely can't have that kind of thing happen. So my point with all that is that it's hard to know how much suppression is going on, although I'll tell you, we sure are learning a great deal of it bit by bit as we go here.
It's kind of scary because we can't know until sometime in the future just how much is going on today. Do you think there'll be a significant difference in the amount of suppression going on if the administration changes in this November election and Clinton or Obama gets in? Do you think there'll be a difference?
Well, you know, it's hard to say. Before I answer that question directly, let me say, in the book, When you read the book, you see that this is not a partisan attack on Republicans by any means. I talk about what Lyndon Baines Johnson did to suppress dissent in the 1960s. I talk about what Bill Clinton did in the 1990s and how a lot of the legislation that he pushed through, for example, the 1996 Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act, that laid the foundation for what was to become the USA Patriot Act in 2001. So it's definitely not that Republicans only suppress dissent and Democrats don't. It's hard to say, it's hard to predict what Clinton or Obama would do when they're in office, but in a large part, these organizations like the FBI operate autonomously from the president. Sure, the president has ultimate oversight, but in large part, we saw this during the reign of J. Edgar Hoover. He was director of the FBI from 1924 to 1972, and he roved quite autonomously, much to the chagrin sometimes of those presidents like Lyndon Baines Johnson, who I mentioned, or John F. Kennedy, or even Eisenhower to a certain degree. So it's hard to say whether Hillary Clinton or Obama will be suppressing this dissent with more vigor than, say, the George Bush administration.
We better keep moving on here because we can go on for a long time with what you're saying. Let's look at the next question. You say that media frames dissent views in 5 ways. What are the 5 ways, and why do you think that media does this? How might media frame dissent views in a more objective manner, a way that discussion of the dissidents' major points might be encouraged?
Mm-hmm. Well, that gets back at the question that I brought up before about mass media deprecation or denigration or poking fun at. And part of that deprecation is focusing on the outward characteristics of individual dissidents and not talking about their ideas, in fact. Not even discussing their dissident opinions, but rather getting swerved onto their goatee, their nose ring, their long purple hair. Now, obviously, I've got nothing against people with nose rings, goatees, long purple hair, or even beards. But
Obama in an African garb and turban.
Right, I don't have anything against that either. But what I have a problem with is when the media focuses on those things at the expense of the real reason why these people are out on the streets. And the same thing will happen to conservative groups as well as to liberal groups. They'll focus in on the more sort of extremist dimensions, if you will, of various movements at the expense of talking about their basic ideas. So to get back at the question, the violence frame that I mentioned before, dissidents are portrayed as violent, even if it's smashing a window. That's definitely violence across the mass media board. Dissidents are also talked about through what I call a disruption frame. Not just that they're disrupting the machinations of IMF or World Bank meetings, IMF being the International Monetary Fund. It's not just that disruption, because that's what the dissidents are trying to do in the cases that I look at in the book, but it's disruption of the general population that's focused on as well in media accounts about how Joe Blow can't make it to work on time because of this darn protest, and you see how inconvenient all these people are who are taking to the street. Again, what gets lost in that? The reason why they're going to the street. Instead, they focus on the outcome of that, which is the slowdown for somebody trying to get to work on time or something like that. Another frame that you see, especially in regards to that global justice movement I've been talking about, is what I call an amalgam of grievances frame. You might watch the news when there's a protest, and the commentators on the news might say, look at all these wild and crazy and disparate and different causes that these people are taking to the streets for. And usually that's seen as a very negative thing. Whereas if you talk to people in the groups that are involved in these protests, more often than not, they actually think that the diversity of these causes are the strength of these causes. See how you can see the interconnection of these various issues that maybe on the surface don't seem connected, but actually that bind us all together into a bigger struggle. Now, that's not to say that many people who are involved in these movements don't also question focusing perhaps for certain times on specific issues. But when you look at mass media accounts, it's almost across the board that having this wide range, this diverse range of issues that you're taking on is a negative thing. And so those are some of the frames that I talk about when I'm discussing those two protests. But each specific episode of contention, or when people take to the streets, put boots to the pavement, each episode of contention needs to be taken on its own. And different frames might develop from different groups. I'll leave that for your viewer researchers to continue.
So, do you think of any groups now that come to mind that are engaged in dissent now that may be subject to super surveillance by the administration? What about Judy Barry and the blowing up her?
Mm-hmm.
You remember that story?
I do, in fact, yes. The book starts off with that account of Judy Barry and Daryl Cherney, who were activists within an environmental group called Earth First.
Dissenting group,
a radical environmentalist group, and they were driving in her Subaru, and the Subaru blew up. And the FBI was immediately on the scene, local police forces and authorities as well, and the instant reaction was to blame Judy Barry and Daryl Cherney for blowing up the car, saying that they were in fact carrying a pipe bomb. Well, in fact, that turned out not to be true. Judy Barry won a settlement many, many years later once she sort of whirled her way through the labyrinth of litigation, ultimately winning some money on that. So yeah, there's environmental radicals, people that are willing to put their body on the line to protect the environment, that are most assuredly being surveilled today.
But then where does that story or that information play out in the media? They report it, but it's on page 19 and very small print. Mm-hmm. So the media is complicit with the administration in suppressing dissent and not having the ordinary citizenry be aware of the reality of what's going on and why it is that they can't get health care for their old grandmother and for their children, and why it is they can't afford to keep a roof over their heads and holding 2 or 3 jobs. Because if people were informed, then they would know who's responsible for their plight in the world. So I think that the media and the corporations and the ruling elite are complicit. They're one and the same. Because if you and I know too much of the reality of what's going on, we might speak up. But if they're clever enough to convince us that it's somebody else's fault, or it may be the illegal immigrants coming across the border, then the result is what we've got going on right now. And people like myself, if I may, who try to, I don't have all the answers, but I've lived enough and I've seen enough stuff going on to where I can probably see a little more of where we're being hoodwinked by the media, who is in the service of the ruling elite. And Billy Joe, if you hear this, why, you should be here. I invited you to come tonight and talk about this. He and I go at it to and fro. He's pretty centrist in his thinking, you know, but I try to make him up as a right-winger. So,
well, you put your finger on the pulse of another important dimension of how dissent gets marginalized through the media. One is what I've been talking about, which is how it's actually reported on. What's the actual content of stories, and how that can sort of swerve us away from what the dissidents would like us to be thinking about, like what they're concerned with in society. But you mentioned the page number as well, which I think is really important, that often gets missed, is that page placement, where the story appears, is important. Some people might not get to page A19 or whatever. That's one aspect of it. But also, when you see a story on page A19, you automatically think that it's not as important as the story that appeared on page 1. Mm-hmm. So when you see dissent being covered later in the paper, it's a cue for you by the media editors, really, that it's not as important as other issues that they've opted to put on the front page or the second page or whatever. Now, I know there's layout issues. If you read the Oregonian, for instance, every day on page A2 at the top, there's a question of national importance, usually about legislation or a fight between the executive branch and the legislative branch. So there's aspects of layout like that. But otherwise, I think the point is important.
Yeah, gosh, I hate to slow us down now. I think our time is running kind of short, but you wanted to talk about something that's hopeful about that you're saying in Beyond Bullets. Mm-hmm. Let's change the tone a little bit here so that the viewers can have some hope or something that they can do to resist or to do something about this suppression that's going on that may be affecting them. Mm-hmm.
Well, as I mentioned earlier on, as I researched this book, this is bleak stuff, and it can get you in a sort of sad state. But then I started thinking about all these dissidents that I was writing about, whether it was Martin Luther King Jr. or even before him, his predecessors like Frederick Douglass, John Brown, Harriet Tubman, who fought against slavery, for instance. You think John Brown, who incidentally toted a gun, by the way, and who'd definitely be called a terrorist today, and was definitely deprecated on the pages of the New York Times in his day. But you think they walked out on their porch during slavery time and just thought, hey, this is going to be easy. No problem, it's just slavery. Of course not. Slavery felt like an implacable, impossible force to overcome. So if you walk out on your front porch now and you think that what's going on in terms of surveillance, in terms of wars around the world is implacable, impossible to change, I would urge a little bit of historical long vision backwards to put it all in a little bit of perspective. Same thing with the women's movement. If it weren't for an in-the-streets, boots-to-pavement struggle, women still wouldn't be voting today. If it weren't for in-the-streets, boots-to-pavement struggle, we would still have institutionalized racism based in the laws. Now, I'm not saying we've overcome racism by any sense, but those forces also seemed impossible to deal with. So I thought, the more I thought about it, I think there is a lot of reason for hope.
But there's got to be some small number of us who are going to take to the streets and put the boots to the pavement, as you put it. It always turns out that way, huh? You got to shut the system down.
I agree. I agree. I mean, I think that you have to get out on the streets. I mean, a lot of people these days talk about activism through the keyboard, basically. And I'm not saying don't write an email to your legislators. I'm not saying don't write an email to various corporations you think are doing awful things. But I think you've got to take your boots to the pavement as well.
Okay, they're yelling at me now. It's time to keep moving here. So it's close to time for us to stop. Keep your pens and pencils handy because you may want to jot down something that we'll show you in the closing credits. Thanks for watching. And I invite you to give us feedback, both positive and negative, about any aspect of the show. And my email address is friendlydown@aol.com. And you saw Jules's email address next to his name there. I have a few public service announcements that I always do, and I have a few extras this evening because David Delk couldn't be here. Let's talk about the Alliance for Democracy. That's a national organization that I've belonged to for a long time, and it's an activist organization that really puts boots to the pavement to challenge and take care of social issues. And let's put up the screen for the local chapter. Progressive Populist Movement. There's the Portland chapter. There's the website and the phone number to talk to David about coming to our meetings. We meet about twice a month, every Monday evening, and we have some good discussions there. Now, there's some other activities going on now at the Unitarian Church in downtown Portland here. We'll put those up on the screen, yeah. The Alliance for Democracy event, Thirst, a documentary on Friday, March 7th. Take that down. And Uncounted is another film that's going to be shown at the Unitarian Church downtown. And Maud Barlow is the third one. There's the date. And let's have the address of where the church is in downtown Portland. The First Unitarian Church, Southwest 12th between Salmon and Main. And the next slide, please. There's David Delk, the phone number, and the website, or his email address, how to learn more about those three events coming up. Let's move ahead now to the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union. I've been a member for many, 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 many years. It's a great organization, and thank goodness we have the ACLU. We got to have somebody, some national organization that's looking out for our what's the word?
Civil liberties?
Civil liberties, yeah, of course. I'm trying to rush and get things through here. Also, I want to tell you about the American Humanist Association. That's another organization that I belong to. We meet every Sunday morning, and like regular church folk. And let's put up the schedule for Sunday morning activities for the month of March. We meet, oh boy, it's pretty small, every Monday morning at 9:30 to 11. And there's some of the topics. Now, we have two programs going on every Sunday morning. We have a main program, and then upstairs, there's an open discussion or discussion where there's a topic that's chosen. So you can email me or call me, and I'll give you more information about that because that's pretty small. I'll make that a little clearer next time around. And we also want to tell you about the Senior Studies Institute, SSI. I'm a member of that organization. and we meet and discuss topical issues. And no, we don't have that one available. Okay. All right. Before we say goodnight, I want to say a big thank you to my wonderful crew and to the managers and teachers at Tualatin Valley Community Television, TVCTV studios in Beaverton, Oregon, where I produce and host the Conversations with Dr. Don shows. I also want to thank you viewers in other parts of the country where you're watching. Thank you for watching. And for your Washington County, Oregon viewers. If you didn't get all the broadcast information we had on the screen earlier, you can get it on the web at www.yourtvtv.org or at my website, www.donbaham.com. If you live in another part of the country and are watching this show, contact your local community access cable TV studio for information about when they plan to broadcast Dr. Don shows in the future. Again, my email address is friendlydon@aol.com. Email me and tell me what you think. You have a closing thought or comment in about 20 seconds.
Well, I would just say thank you so much for all the work you do to bring these important issues out to the public. I think it's really great what you're doing. So thanks for having me on the show.
Thank you for coming on too. And maybe I'll have you back on again. Will you take a chance of coming back on again?
Sounds like fun.
So remember, I have a motto I always talk about. It's KFC. And nothing to do with chicken or Kentucky Fried Chicken. It's Dr. Don's KFC. It's kind, friendly, and charitable. Be kind, be friendly, and be charitable to you. And you, and you, and you, especially you.